Guys, I am back with my friend, the absolutely incredible David Fajgenbaum. David, you continue to be this absurd spark of joy in my life as I watch you bulldoze every obstacle. I know that you're a human being and you can have problems, etc., in your own personal time, but in my mind, you are the embodiment of someone who has decided to try to find a way through structural obstacles. And I just feel so lucky that A, you're my friend, and that B, you're back and we get to talk about everything that you've been doing.
Okay, the feelings are so mutual. I feel the same way about you, and I'm just so happy to be back on with you.
You're the easiest person to be on your team. Since our episode aired, you co-founded an organization called EveryCure. Tell me what is behind the impetus of EveryCure.
Sure. So, I'm alive because of a drug that wasn't made for my disease. As you know, I was so sick with this disease called Castleman's, had my last rites read to me, nearly died 5 times from it. And then all of a sudden I found this drug that had been around for decades for other diseases, and it saved my life. And actually in January, I celebrated 10 years in remission. And so, right, Kate, it's like crazy,
years.
right?
Holy crap. That is a decade
I know.
of like
I used to
you
measure
being a dad,
Yeah.
you being a husband, you being like a life-changing researcher. That's
I used to, measure it in months, and now all of a sudden, like for the first time, someone just said it's a decade. I was like, oh my gosh, I used to measure my remissions in months, and now I can measure them in decades. And so you can imagine for me, Kate, being on a drug that wasn't made for my disease and literally being alive today because of something that wasn't meant for me. All I can think about is how many more drugs are out there that could help more people. And so, yes, I've spent the last 10 years here at Penn repurposing drugs. We've done this now 16 times, finding a new use for existing drug. But then 2 years ago, we launched EveryCure because we believe that every FDA-approved drug should be used for every disease and every patient possible.
It's a weird economy. And I think that's why I always feel so relaxed in front of you is for people inside of healthcare, for people who have tried to navigate it successfully or unsuccessfully, like we know that there are like green lights and red lights that allow us to sometimes do what's really in patients' best interests and sometimes really have to just mostly line up the financials and the incentives. Like, how do you think about EveryCure as a way to kind of bridge some of those gaps?
That's exactly why we created EveryCure. There's 3,000 approved drugs, and 80% of those drugs are generic, which means that they're not profitable for companies, which means that 80% of the drugs that can help you, Kate, or can help me, no one's doing any research on. And that just blows my mind. And so that's why EveryCure exists, is to take those drugs, the 80% that no one's researching, and then take all of the diseases, which actually there's thousands of them that don't have treatments, and then matching them together. Let's take the drugs we have within reach and match them to the people who are suffering right now.
Because you said something that really stuck with me about just wishing that there was like there was a somebody out there who was thinking about us. And it's such I don't know, that always struck me in such like a place of like deep sadness is like, but is really nobody thinking about like, does my thing not rise to the surface of being important? And you have it's such like a deep calling you have toward all these people who have been kind of left behind, behind. There is no them, that them is I forget how you described it one time. You were like, I think it's just going to be me then. I guess.
Kate, yes, it was this. At one point, I was like, they must have looked at that drug for Castleman's. And I was like, wait a minute. Is there a they out there? And then I'm like, I've like been saying they must, we say they all the time in our society, like they must have done this. And it's like, they did that. And it's like, wait, is there a they? And then all of a sudden I learned that for the vast majority of diseases, there is no they. And then I was like, well, maybe we need to create a they. So EveryCure is they and we are them. and we're trying to find drugs for diseases that don't have any treatments.
When you talk about AI, I feel less terrified. I feel mostly concerned about AI, but you're using it in this really innovative way. Can you explain it to me in a way that a humanities person will understand?
Sure. So we are utilizing, so there's 3,000 approved drugs that it's amazing. 3,000 drugs that humanity has created. And there's 22,000 human diseases that affect all of us. You and I have a couple of those 22,000 diseases. And so we are looking for matches between every drug and every disease to see among those 3,000 drugs, what are all the diseases they might treat. And so there's 66 million scores that have to be generated. It's 3,000 times 22,000, right? So no human could ever say, like, I'm going to generate 66 million scores. But utilizing artificial intelligence, we do that. And the way we do it actually is we use an algorithm almost identical to Netflix. So when you go on Netflix to decide what show you might want to watch, Netflix tells you these are like the 5 shows you might watch. And Netflix is really good. You're like, oh my gosh, that's great. I like love that show.
Me.
Like, how do you know?
You're like, that's embarrassing.
I know. You're like,
I would never definitely watch that.
And then you watch it and you're like, I love it, right?
Not again.
And so the way that it does that is that Netflix uses something called a random forest model. So basically it's created a profile for you. It says, this is Kate's profile. And then it creates a profile for each of the movies, all the ones you've watched, all the ones you haven't watched, and says, this is the kind of movie that Kate's going to like. So we utilize a random forest model, just like Netflix, but we look at every drug and every disease to say this drug tends to work for this disease. So it has a profile like this. What are other diseases like that other disease? And we make connections. So now we can come up with 66 million scores within a couple of days, as opposed to, of course, it would take us years to do that if we were doing it manually.
I just interviewed Francis Collins. And so hearing the word billions associated with trying to understand the human genome,
Yes.
It's just, these scale issues are so wild when it comes to the complexity of our diseases. That's so exciting to think about problems as clusters rather than, because to us, they just, I mean, I'm sure you'd never used the word Castlemans before it became like the most important noun in your life.
You're exactly right. Yeah. I mean, just to think about the complexity, like you said, if you talk to Francis Collins, he talked about 3 billion sequences in your genome. And now we're talking about millions of patients. And to your point, the scalability is impossible for a human. But all of a sudden, artificial intelligence can actually scale these sorts of concepts in ways that we just couldn't.
We have these clinical trial models that go like, whatever is good for the group is going to be what's best for everybody. And with all of the advances every day in what we understand about genes and these like N of 1 groups that we can make modifications for. I mean, like just this last week, I think that I'm right. There was a study that was published about the cure for sickle cell anemia.
Yes.
Like, what the what?
Yes.
Like no one thought you could cure that. It's an exciting time to be really hopeful.
It is. And, you and I have talked about hope a lot over these years and how hope can be so powerful. It can also be paralyzing. It can also be, it can drive us to take action. And I think this is one of those moments where we can be really hopeful for all of those reasons. There's people doing work. There's, maybe the solution is going to be delivered to us. It's a really special time.
One of the saddest thoughts I would always have is just feeling that the second I learned more about what was wrong with me, the more I realized that I didn't know, and it was always overwhelming. And like lately I've been trying to be my own geneticist, and it's like such a disaster. It's such a disaster. I like figured out where the search engine is and have like none of the letters in the right order. And it gets really overwhelming for all of the non-specialists of the world in any kind of problem to look at something that's so complicated. And you're you and your emotional bandwidth, you just like, you see a terrible problem and your heart just like opens, which is, I think, honestly, one of the most, it's such a beautiful thing to see up close. It's why you're such a little miracle. I wonder, for all those who are like overwhelmed by a problem in their life and they can't be the ones to generate the tools to solve it, what are some of the emotional tools that you use to kind of stay open to a yet unsolvable problem?
Gosh, such an important question. First off, I should say that what you just described is how I describe my mom, who passed away from cancer 20 years ago. And she she would talk about this idea of we shouldn't just look for silver linings, we should look to create silver linings. So meaning that like when the horrible things happen, like that's when you should go do, create, take action. But to your point, sometimes that's just not what we need to do. It's just not right for us at this moment. We don't necessarily, maybe we're not ready, or it just isn't the right thing for us. So I think that there's three things that I think about a lot in these tough situations. So one, I try to reflect on what am I hoping for, wishing for, praying for? Like, what is that thing that you want to occur? So that's sort of the first thing. The second is who can I have by my side? So for me, it's Caitlin, my amazing wife, or it's my sisters or my dad. Like they've just been there for everything. So it's, how can I sort of have the right people? I've got my vision in the future. I've got my people by my side. And then for me, it's just the cliche, like one step at a time, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's a cliche because it's true. And so the one step at a time might be different for different, for different people, right? So like my one step at a time might be that I might be looking to try to find a signature for a drug that might be in my, that can maybe treat me based on some proteomics data I generated. But it might be that your one step at a time might be, to your point, calling a few different doctors because the first couple doctors actually weren't the right doctors for you. Yeah. Maybe it was the third doctor. And every one of those action steps is so important. And so I think that I guess I would encourage just reflecting on what you're hoping for, reflecting on what you're praying for, asking what can you do to try to achieve that thing that you're hoping for, but not necessarily putting all the weight on your shoulders to have to be the one who's doing it.
That's so good. That's so good. Because I know that when I get stuck, I often feel like there must be something I'm doing wrong. And usually, I mean, I'm a smart person. I say to myself quietly in these moments, but usually it's because I realized like a door was locked and I need to try a different door.
Yes.
Instead of just like immediately turning daggers in, on the problem that I'm facing. But like, I don't know, even this last week, I met a new person in the healthcare system and the door just opened. And I thought that door was closed. I mean, because I've tried it 100 times, David. I've tried it 100 times.
Yeah.
And so like, I really admire all the moments where we just decide to like keep knocking, keep trying, keep being less hard on ourselves for not knowing why we haven't found a solution yet.
Yep.
You're so good at helping people try, David. And I cherish the crap out of you. So
well, it's very mutual.
Okay, I'll keep you. And you can come back anytime you find, well, like every new cure, David, you just come right on back.
Deal.